Here we are at the WDEE-TV studios in Ypsilanti, Michigan. The Michael G. Nastos Show returns for another segment, and I'm very happy to have today Ken Magee, who is the co-author of this new book, The Little Brown Jug, the Michigan-Minnesota Rivalry, talking about college football and this long-standing rivalry for one of the most prized possessions in all of sports, the Little Brown Jug. Ken Magee, the co-author with John M. Stevens, documents this, and a foreword by Glenn E. Shemmy Schembeckler III as well, adding more prominence to the words that are in the book. And once again, we welcome Ken Magee, the co-author, to our studios today. And sir, it's great to have you here to talk about this book.
Thank you. It's a wonderful pleasure to be here.
Talk about the Michigan-Minnesota rivalry a little bit and why it is as important now. Obviously, people fixate on the Ohio State-Michigan rivalry, the Michigan-Michigan State rivalry, but Michigan and Minnesota being kind of distant third, but nonetheless, you have documented it in this book with a lot of images. I see just hundreds of photos of this rivalry. Tell me what inspired you to write this book and how it manifested in producing.
Well, I've been going to Michigan football games since I was a little boy, raised in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and the Michigan-Minnesota rivalry as a kid growing up was to me huge. It normally was on homecoming weekend where they would have floats and parades and things of that nature, but it was also, defeating the Golden Gophers was really important for the University of Michigan Wolverines and winning that jug. But as a little boy growing up, I started to collect sports memorabilia. For example, football programs. I'd take a little plastic bag with me to the game to save the programs. And as I grew older, I would read more and more about Michigan sports and learn more and more.
Show us one of those examples. Show us a good example of one of the
early programs?
Yeah.
For example, here is a program in the 1964 Michigan-Minnesota game that shows Henry Hatch on the cover, who was one of the football equipment managers for decades and decades, and he's shown several times in the book. But this is one of the really neat covers of an old Michigan football program, the type of programs that I would save. This one specifically was in 1964, paying tribute to Henry Hatch.
And it's 50 cents.
50 cents, and I think the Notre Dame program last month was $10.
Wow.
So things have changed a little bit.
A little.
So following the Michigan football legacy, all the history of Michigan football, I learned that really the Minnesota game hadn't really been detailed, except for in news articles here and there. There had been a lot of books on the Michigan-Ohio State series, but Michigan-Minnesota, there was nothing written except for occasional news articles. mvictors.com does a great job documenting some of the articles in the history of the Michigan-Minnesota Little Brown Jug match. For example, Greg Dooley, we call him a jugologist. He studies the jug.
I like that.
He studies the jug an awful lot, and you can see a lot more about the Little Brown Jug on mvictors.com as well. But one of the things that fascinates me about the whole series is this. Michael, so many people focus on the Michigan-Ohio State series.
Yeah.
And in reality, that series was second tier to the Michigan-Minnesota for the first half of the century. Mm-hmm. And I say that, for example, there was a 10-year time period where 7 out of 10 years the national champion was decided because of the Michigan-Minnesota game. And that has never happened with any other team, any other rivalry, any other schools, anywhere in the history of college football since the 1800s. The Michigan-Ohio State series is huge, no question about it, this day and age. But nothing compared to what the Michigan-Minnesota rivalry was back in the day.
I have to hearken back to my first U of M game at the Big House in 1960, where Michigan was defeated 10-0 by the eventual national championship Minnesota team. And that's my first experience. And it leaves this indelible memory in your mind about being there, seeing the way that they play, smelling the atmosphere, being with Michigan football, and then Minnesota comes in and beats them and shuts them out, actually. And that was maybe the termination for the rivalry where Minnesota really dominated. And we're going to talk a little bit about recent domination between U of M and Minnesota, but was that the the beginning of the end for Minnesota? Because Minnesota hasn't had many good football teams since.
Well, in 1960, they did win the national championship.
Right.
The University of Minnesota did. The series really took a dramatic switch in 1969 when Bo Schembechler arrived
Right.
at the University of Michigan. In essence, since that time, the series record is Michigan 38 wins, Minnesota 3 wins.
Wow.
2 of those 3 wins for Minnesota were huge, and we'll talk about that in a little while, as the jug can be a very forceful motivator.
There are other trophies, I'm sure, in sports, but very few rival the Little Brown Jug, and Michigan and Minnesota will have their game coming up in just a few weeks. Ken Magee, the co-author of the Little Brown Jug, the Michigan-Minnesota rivalry, and he's going to be doing book signings for this, and we'll tell you about that later on in the show. The Michael G. Nastos program here on WDEE-TV rolling on in just a moment. Stay tuned. Back with another segment of the Michael G. Nastos Show here on WDEE-TV, coming to you from our studios in Ypsilanti, Michigan. We're sharing Michigan with the world online, and we're with Ken Magee, who co-authored the book, The Little Brown Jug, the Michigan-Minnesota Rivalry in College Football. John M. Stevens is the co-author, along with Ken, who is with us today. And I want to talk about the fact that you have really educated me after reading this book about the Minnesota legacy of football players, and you just mentioned to me that it is an attempt at being a nonpartisan. Obviously, you're a Michigan fan. I come from Michigan. I'm a Michigan fan. But I was fascinated in learning about these great players from Minnesota, especially 3 names that come to my mind anyway. That would be Carl Eller, who played for the Vikings and was a champion player. Leo Namalini, the Leo Lion, as he was known, and Bobby Bell, who was a championship player for the Kansas City Chiefs and helped them win a Super Bowl in the early years. Those are just 3 of the players that Minnesota has brought through the pipeline to produce great championships, not only at Minnesota, but in the NFL. So talk a little bit about the research that you did on these players, and if there are any others that stand out in your mind, because I come up in the 60s watching the NFL, so those are the names that strike me the most.
Well, we did a lot of research, and one of the things we did was we went to the University of Minnesota and to their archives and studied a lot about the players through the University of Minnesota archives. And obviously the internet has been a wonderful tool as well. The 3 players that you mentioned are all in the College Football Hall of Fame at this point in time, as well as the fact, if you look at the history of Minnesota, they've had an unbelievable run of great players over the years. One to mention is Bruce Smith, who won the Heisman Trophy right after Tom Harmon. And there was a historic duel, considered one of the most historic duels in the history of the Michigan-Minnesota rivalry, and that was in 1940 when Tom Harmon and Bruce Smith squared off. Incidentally, I will say, when it comes to Tom Harmon went to his grave regretting one thing, and that is he had never beaten Minnesota in his 3 years as a starter.
Wow, that's an amazing stat.
And he personally took responsibility for 2 of the 3 losses, as he missed an extra point in one game and had a very damaging fumble in another game.
Who had the best stats between Smith and Harmon when they went toe-to-toe?
That's a great question. I'd have to study that.
Okay.
But I will tell you this, that there was another phenomenal player back in those days as well that a lot of people don't know about, and he played for Minnesota for 3 years. His name was Bill Daly. Bill Daly is an incredible football player, and one of the very interesting things about Mr. Bill Daly is he won the Little Brown Jug 4 times. I said he played for Minnesota 3 times, and then he played 1 year at Minnesota. He transferred to, 1 year at Michigan.
Oh, wow.
He transferred to Michigan during the war, and he ended up playing in 6 games and came in 4th in the nation in rushing and was an All-American at Michigan as well.
That's startling.
Bill Daly won the Little Brown Jug 4 times. There's a lot of other great players that played in this historic rivalry, from President Gerald Ford to Pug Lund, who played for Minnesota. The list goes on and on, filled with college football Hall of Famers. An individual by the name of Chuck Bernard, who was a 2-time All-American at the University of Michigan, who was the center for Harry Newman, who won the Fairbanks Trophy, the predecessor to the Heisman Trophy. Chuck Bernard never lost a game against Minnesota in his career. Phenomenal football player. The list goes on, and we document a lot of these wonderful players as well as fantastic coaches in the book.
It's really a great book, I must say, after having read it and thumbed through it, that this is the kind of situation where I think you would avail yourself the opportunity to learn about the Little Brown Jug and the Michigan-Minnesota rivalry, and clearly this is a labor of love for you as well. John Stevens is your co-author. How did he influence this book as well? And I know that many of the photos that you have in the book come from your collection too.
John is a big fan of Michigan football, and he's also very, very good. He was raised in the generation of being technologically savvy with computer skill sets and digital imagery. He worked a lot on the images in regards to getting them into the final production for print. That's how John came to the table. He's also very well known and very knowledgeable about Michigan football, and he did some of the writing as well. So we took my passion and his skill sets, and we combined the two of them.
Why don't you show us another video example as we go out in this segment with just a little bit. Show us something that you like, and we'll talk about the Little Brown Jug and what it is and what it represents in our next segment with Ken Magee, the co-author of the Little Brown Jug, the Michigan-Minnesota rivalry in college football. This is Michael G. Nastos here at WDEE-TV.com talking about college football with Ken Magee. We'll be right back. We're back with our third segment with Ken Magee, the co-author of The Little Brown Jug, the Michigan-Minnesota rivalry, a book that has just been issued, and there'll be book signings with Ken Magee. He signed my book, and I'm very appreciative of that. We're going to talk about The Little Brown Jug itself, and there is a program from 1962 that you have that shows the jug. Talk about the evolution of the jug, where it started, who made it, what's the history behind it.
Let me give you the brief synopsis. Red Wing pottery started in the 1800s in Red Wing, Minnesota. Michigan went up to Minnesota to play a football game in 1903. Fielding Yost had concerns that Minnesota might dope the water. He sent out a young student manager by the name of Tommy Roberts out to buy a water jug. Tommy Roberts spent 30 cents on this piece of Red Wing pottery. Filled it up with water after the game, which was considered a very historic game.
Is it ceramic?
It's pottery. It's made out of earth and clay.
Okay.
Michigan tied Minnesota 3-3 in that game. Minnesota scored with 2 minutes left, and the field was jam-packed with people, and they canceled the game after just said the game's over now, 3-3 tie.
Wow.
Michigan was highly ranked. Minnesota felt that they were in the midst of a huge upset, and they considered the tie a huge upset. Michigan left, somewhat dejected as they were tied, left a water jug in the locker room. Myth over the years has been that Fielding Yost demanded the jug back. That's not true. What happened was the athletic director was given the jug by a gentleman by the name of Oscar Munson, who's the gentleman on the cover of our book right here. Oscar Munson was a football custodian who found the jug in a locker room. He took it to the athletic director, Doc Cook, and they painted on the jug, Michigan 6, Minnesota 6. And the rest is history. It was hung from the ceiling for 6 years in Doc Cook's office. And then in 1909, Michigan went back to play, and it was proposed that, hey, let's play for the jug. And that's how it all happened.
How has the jug physically changed over the years? Is it like the rock where the winning team gets to paint it their colors? Is that what it is?
The jug was painted in the early 20s. This program we showed earlier is really the first rendition of the artwork on the jug as we know it now. The winning team paints the score on the side of the jug, but there are a lot of myths surrounding the Little Brown Jug. First off, it's not little. It weighs over 20 pounds, and it's at least this tall. Okay? It's 20 inches around, and if it was filled with water, it would weigh close to 70 pounds. So it's not the Little Brown Jug. That's number one.
You can't quite give a Gatorade bath with that.
No, it would be very, very difficult. It would be extremely heavy for them to do that. And in answer to your question, a woman by the name of Jill Gordon here in Ann Arbor, a local artist, paints the jug when it's won by Michigan. And it hasn't been won by Minnesota very often, and they'll have their respective painter when and if they take it back.
What's another really big myth about this rivalry and the jug?
Well, we've talked about one, about Yost demanding it back. Number one, didn't happen. Number two, as we've talked about it being little and brown, and so that's number two. Number three is there's a great story that the jug was stolen in 1931 from the Michigan Athletic Department, and it was held hostage and stolen. And then all of a sudden, one ends up in a clump of bushes behind the Bear Claw Coffee which used to be the Toomey Hills gas station. For over a year, Fielding Yost said this is the real jug. And a year later, another jug shows up that turns out to be the real jug. And so there's a great picture in the book of Fielding Yost with his staff standing in front of two different jugs. A wonderful, wonderful picture. So that's another story. So it's got some intrigue to it. Again, it's a great, forceful motivator for a coach to utilize.
What's the story about the fake jug? And that's at Washtenaw and
Washtenaw Stadium in Washington.
The old Toomey gas station, which I remember.
Which is now Bear Claw Coffee Company.
Right.
And basically, it was considered the fictitious jug that somehow somebody painted one up and tried to pass it off as the real jug.
And that lasted for quite a few years before they found the real one?
A couple years.
Oh,
a couple years.
Couple of years.
Yeah.
Any other misconceptions, besides the color and the fact that it's not little, any other one little tidbit?
Well, some people think it's a fake jug, but Greg Dooley has done a lot of work and worked with some art people who were art experts in ceramics and has compared digital photographs from the early 1900s to the current jug and pretty much believes that this is the real jug. So the myth that it was replaced. There's also a reputation out there that the jug handle was broken. It doesn't appear to have ever been broken. So those are some of the main myths.
We're here with Ken Magee, who wrote the book, The Little Brown Jug, The Michigan-Minnesota Rivalry in College Football. He's the co-author with John M. Stevens, and we'll be back with our final segment with Ken Magee in just a bit here on WDEE-TV. Michael G. Nastos with my show today. We're back with our final segment today of the Michael G. Nastos Show. Thanks to my producer, Ray B., for being here and taking care of biz. And my guest today is Ken Magee, who wrote the book, co-wrote the book, The Little Brown Jug, the Michigan-Minnesota Rivalry. And there's the book. It is on sale, and you can purchase it. And Ken, I want to talk about the fact that the Jug gives kind of a forceful motivation to these players. Michigan has dominated the rivalry since the late 60s, and I think we have a program here from 1970 that we can show just briefly in a minute. But there is something going on here with the Michigan-Minnesota programs. Michigan, obviously, since the Bo Schembechler era, has dominated a lot. But this year, with Michigan's program being down, maybe that opens the door just a little bit for the Golden Gophers to win the game.
Well, this program is from 1910, and Michigan won.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought it was 1970.
That one's from 1910, a very historic battle as well. But let's talk about when we spoke about a forceful motivator. One of the things that, doing the research for this book, and having the opportunity to be a close friend of Shemmy Schembechler, Bo's son, who you mentioned earlier wrote the foreword. In the foreword, Shemmy Schembechler speaks about his father, and he said that his father was 19-2 against the Gophers, but the two losses against Michigan were incredibly huge losses. Minnesota, in those 2 years, in 1977 and 1986, were average teams. Michigan went into Minnesota in 1977 expecting to win the game, and what ended up happening was Michigan was ranked number 1 in the country and was shut out 16-0. The Minnesota players, their coaches, the Little Brown Jug is a forceful motivator. And then Michigan goes and plays in 1986, ranked number 2 in the country. Loses to Minnesota. Again, 5 turnovers by the Wolverines. So 2 examples of where a number 1 and a number 2 Michigan team was knocked out of the national championship race because of an inspired Minnesota team.
I have great nightmares about the Detroit Tigers and the Minnesota Twins. The last 2 nights are good examples, but of course the Twins knocking out the Tigers in a playoff series about 20 years ago. So I have no love in my heart for Minnesota sports teams. So this is another example of why those teams from the North, we got to respect them, but we can't like them a lot.
Well, in 2003, again, we talk about the forceful motivator. Michigan played in a game called the Miracle on the Metrodome. It was on a Friday night because the Twins were supposed to play Saturday morning in the playoffs.
I can't imagine playing football in that place.
Well, Michigan was losing 28-7 and came back in the fourth quarter and ended up winning the game on a Garrett Rivas field goal near the end of the game. And again, the greatest comeback in Michigan's 134-year football history. The Jug can be an incredible, forceful motivator.
Right. Talk about book signings. You have one coming up at Nicola's and the M-Den right before the next Michigan-Minnesota football game. So tell us a little bit about where you'll be and getting the book signed and where you can purchase it.
On September 22nd at 7 o'clock at night at Nicola's Bookstore, we are going to have a signing, and we also, besides the signing, have a nice PowerPoint presentation showing a lot of very beautiful color images and a brief synopsis of the series. So we encourage you to attend that. One of the other signings we're very excited about is Friday night, the day before the Little Brown Jug game on September 26th. That's a Friday. I said night. It's in the afternoon from 3 to 5 at the M-Den on State Street. In the upper level, we'll be doing a book signing. And what I would really like your viewers to understand is this. What's so phenomenal about the M-Den signing is we will have the real Little Brown Jug, which is normally kept under lock and key at an undisclosed location here in Ann Arbor when the U of M possesses the jug. We will have the real Little Brown Jug on display at the M-Den Friday, September 26th during our signing from 3 to 5.
Talk about the proceeds. A portion of the proceeds in selling the book will go to your charity, as far as
I started a foundation after 3+ decades in law enforcement, the Ken Magee Foundation for Cops. A portion of the proceeds of my book will go to support my foundation, which is being formed to take police officers who are permanently injured in the line of duty to Michigan football games and other athletic events. And that will include transportation, lodging, tickets, tailgate. So thank you for asking about the foundation.
We're going to close out by giving you some examples of these programs that Ken has brought along, and we'll close with showing you these examples. We'll take about 30 seconds to show you these. And once again, my guest has been Ken Magee, co-author of the book The Little Brown Jug, The Michigan-Minnesota Rivalry. John M. Stevens and Ken have authored this book. There are a lot of great black and white photos, and you're seeing some color examples of these programs that Ken has collected. By the way, he is a professional musician, or I should say he's a professional magician, let me clear that up, as well as part owner of a sports memorabilia shop, which is next to Antelope Antiques, underneath the Afternoon Delight on West Liberty Street in Ann Arbor. And I encourage...
That would be East Liberty.
East Liberty, okay. Let me correct myself then. And I encourage you to go and hang out with him, see his collection of posters and memorabilia and sports items. And we will once again close by showing you these examples of these programs. And once again, Ken, thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate it. And Ken's career goes far deeper than this book, but we won't go into that. But I want to thank him again for coming in. And this is the Michael G. Nastos Show here at WDEE-TV.com, sharing Michigan with the world. We'll see you again soon with another example of a community member or people who are giving us added incentive to live here in the state of Michigan and in the Metro Detroit area by offering themselves artistically, politically, commercially, or otherwise. Once again, thanks to Ken Magee.
Thank you.